Hello, everyone. So, this is something a little bit different from what I usually do. I'm going to go ahead and spend a video talking about linguistics. This isn't something that I normally talk about. I don't think I've ever made a video specifically about language before. And it's not really something that's personally interesting to me, to be perfectly honest. I'm not really the kind of person who gets really interested by foreign languages the way some people do. I mean, they're interesting to some extent, but not any more interesting than any other, field of study. They don't have any very special appeal for me in the way that, some people just get really fascinated by languages and how they work. So, but I did want to talk about a few things pertaining to language because I have become somewhat multilingual. In the past few years, I've learned a foreign language to enough proficiency that I can, I guess, speak it on the street and in everyday situations. And I wanted to kind of introduce people to one thing which is often not very well understood. One of the things which people really seem to have trouble with when they're learning some foreign languages, and even in our native language of English, speaking for myself and to my fellow native English speakers, even we as native English speakers sometimes have problems with this in a particular form, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And that subject, which we sometimes have trouble with, is the subject of grammatical case. Now, exactly what is case? It's kind of a stupid word. It's a very general word, which by itself doesn't really tell you much if you're not clear on what it is. It's kind of a, I admit it's a stupid term. It's a stupid way to kind of attach a label to it. But what is case? Let me go ahead and introduce you to a situation in which case becomes apparent in English, because people say that English doesn't use cases, and that's not really true. English does not have as much of a case system as some other languages, but English definitely does have cases. It's just we don't really think about it in the way that some people think about it in other languages. So let me go ahead and type a couple of simple sentences. Let's say, I talk to John, for example. A very simple sentence, right? I talk to John. Now let's turn this around. What happens if John does the talking? Then you would say, John talks to me, right? Now, what's different about these two sentences? Of course, we reverse the order. So in one case, I'm doing the talking, and in the second case, John is doing the talking. But what's different about the words that we use? Well, of course, there's talk and there is talks, but that's something different. That's verb conjugation. That's how you conjugate verbs, and that's something completely different, which I'm not going to talk about here because I think that's something that we're pretty familiar with. So I talk, you talk, he talks, she talks, we talk, they talk. That's verb conjugation. That's something which I think most people get pretty intuitively, so I'm not going to talk about that here. But what else is different? In the first sentence, we use the word I to refer to myself. I'm talking to John in that case. But when John does the talking, you don't say, John talks to I. It just sounds weird, doesn't it? John talks to I. No, he doesn't. John doesn't talk to I. John talks to me. Why? Why is it that if John is doing the talking to me, you don't say to I, you say to me? What's different? This is an example of what's a case. This is how cases become apparent in language. And most often, case has to do with the difference between who or what is doing something and who or what is having something done to them. So in the first sentence, for example, who is the actor? Me. I'm talking, right? Who's doing the talking? I am. Nobody else. I'm doing the talking here. So I am, in that case, what's called the subject. The subject is the, let's say, the entity, person, or thing, which is doing something. So, in the first sentence, I am the subject. I am the subject of the sentence because I am the one who's doing something. In the second sentence, John is doing something. Who's talking in the second sentence? John is. John is talking. John talks. So, in the second sentence, John is the subject, but each sentence has a subject, and then what's the complement to the subject? That is the object. The object is the entity which technically you can say receives the action. That's kind of an awkward way of putting it if you're not familiar with the terminology, but basically the something which has something done to them. So if I'm talking to John, I am the subject because I'm doing the action, and John is receiving the action, so he's the object of the sentence. And in the second sentence, John is the subject because he's doing something, and I am the object because I am receiving the action of John talking to me. Now, in English, we have pronouns like this. We have words like I and me, which indicate the difference between the subject and the object. So, first person, if I'm talking about myself, that's first person. First person subject word in English is I. I do this, I do that. I am something, I am something else, I am somebody. That's me. I am doing something, so I say I for me being the subject. And if I'm the object, if I'm receiving the action, then we say me. And we can see this in other sentences, like, for example, we can say, if we replace John with a generic pronoun, we can say I talk to him. Him is, again, an object word. We don't say I talk to he, but if the guy, the man or male entity in question is doing something, then it becomes he. We can say he talks to me. See how that works? So he is the subject pronoun for the subject of the sentence. If there's a guy doing something in the sentence, then he is the subject and he becomes he. But if the guy in the sentence is the object, then he's not doing something, he's having something done to him. In this case, I'm talking to him. He's not the subject, he's the object, and so we call him a him. So, that is what's a subject and what's an object. The subject is, again, whoever's doing something, and the object is whoever's having something done to them. In English, we have what you sometimes when you're studying languages, you'll hear something like subject, verb, object ordering, or SVO ordering. So if somebody says, is English an SVO language? The answer is yes. English is usually an SVO. I mean, I guess there are some exceptions, but generally English is an SVO language. This has to do with word ordering, because normally what we do in English is we put the subject first, then the verb, and then the object. So for example, we couldn't say, oh, just for example, if I say I talk to John, well, you could say something like, to John I talk. This is technically, if you're a native English speaker and you start saying something like this, it sounds very poetic. It sounds really awkward and strained. It's not false. It's not absolutely wrong to say, instead of I talk to John, you can say to John I talk. But then it sounds like you're Yoda from Star Wars or something like that. It just sounds very awkward and strained. So it's not truly wrong, but it violates the usual form of English, which is subject, verb, object. Many other languages are a bit more flexible in their ordering. In many other languages, and this is one of the advantages of a case system, is it allows you to be more flexible with how you order things. You don't necessarily have to use subject, verb, object. In some languages, you can kind of mix things up a little bit. But in English, we usually do it that way. So in English, we have not really as much of a case system as other languages, but cases in English are basically shown by pronouns like he and him, and by the word order, subject, verb, object. So in English, word order is really important. That's usually, word order and pronouns is usually how cases are reflected in English. And this is the system in many other languages as well, like French, for example, uses pretty much the same thing. French also depends pretty much on word order and pronouns. And I believe most Romance languages like Spanish and Italian are the same. The exception is Romanian. Romanian uses a more complex case system, which it inherited from Latin, and which it hasn't gotten rid of like most of the other Romance languages. But anyway, so what we have here then, these are the two main types of cases in English. So what we have is first what's called the, I'll go ahead and put some extra lines here to show that I'm defining some new terms here. We have what's called the nominative case. And the nominative case refers to the subject of the sentence. Then in English, we have what's called the oblique case, which refers to the object of the sentence. And these are really only the two main cases, I guess you could say, in English. So you have the nominative case. If you say, I do something, like I talk, that is me being in the nominative case. I'm in the nominative case here because I'm the subject. So that's a nominative case, grammatical case in English. And then if I say I talk to him, whoever he is receiving the action, and so he is in the oblique case in English. And that's it. Those are really the only two cases that people tend to have trouble with in English. There is a third case in English called the genitive case, and that's for something like, that's for possession. And so things like you might say, this book is mine, for example. This word mine, of course not referring to like digging minerals out of the ground, but mine is in possession. That's a genitive case in English. So this book is mine, or a word like ours. This book is ours. That's also the genitive case in English. But that's very clearly, that's something relating to possession. I own this book. This book is mine. Or we own this book. This book is ours. So that's usually something people don't have trouble with. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But other than that possessive case, genitive case, there are only these two main cases in English, nominative and oblique case. Now, where people run into this, where people run into trouble with this, is in the distinction between who and whom. People don't usually have trouble with the difference between he and him. If you're a native English speaker, you can usually intuitively say, I talk to him. You don't say, I talk to he. It doesn't make sense. You don't say, I talk to he. I talk to him. And if he talks to me, then he talks to me, not him talks to me. That doesn't make sense. But people mix up who and whom because they're not used to kind of thinking about it in this way. But it works the same way. Who is a nominative word, and whom is the oblique word. So, for example, what's an example of, well, okay. I mean, a simple way that you can think about this, I guess, is if you ask a question, like obviously there's a question, who left the lights on? So this is nominative because the person did it. We're talking about a person who left the lights on. So that's an action, right? That's the subject of the question. The subject here is somebody who committed the act of leaving the lights on, and so that's nominative. On the other hand, I don't know, you could ask a question like, for example, whom have you spoken with? Now, see the difference here? In this case, I'm asking not who did something, but who received the action. I'm saying you spoke with someone, so you did the action in this case. You are the person who committed the action, and then the who in question is not someone who did anything, but someone who was spoken to. So that's a whom. The person here is someone who had an action committed to them. And that's the difference. Basically, if you're asking about somebody who did something, then it's the nominative case, and so it's who. If somebody had something done to them, it's whom. Sometimes it's kind of difficult. It takes some practice. If you're not used to thinking about it in this way, it definitely takes some practice. But generally speaking, it's that simple. It's as simple as, did the person do something, or did they have something done to them? Who left the lights on? They did something. It's who, because it's nominative. Whom have you spoken with? They didn't do something. They had something done to them. So it's oblique. And so some other examples, like for example, you can make a more kind of convoluted sentence like, that is the person who I don't know, who wrote a book about, I don't know, cats. That is the person who wrote a book about cats. Who did something here? Who committed an action in this sentence? They did. The person we're talking about did an action. And so we use who, because they actually did the action. They wrote. What's the verb in this sentence? Wrote. They wrote a book about cats, and so they did it, and so it's the nominative case. They did the action, and so it's who, not whom. On the other hand, you could say something like, that is the person whom I used to know. Now, who's doing something here? I am. What's the verb here? Know. I used to know them. Who did that? I did. I used to know them. And so we're not talking about somebody who did anything, but who had something done to them. I'm doing the action here, even though knowing isn't really, in this sense, knowing isn't like an active action. You're not really committing anything by knowing something, but linguistically you're actually doing the verb, because you're saying I used to know them, and so linguistically that's a verb, that's committing the verb. And so the person is not the subject but the object, the recipient of that verb, and so the person becomes whom, a person whom I used to know, because they're not doing anything, I'm doing something to them by knowing them. I guess if you're knowing them in the biblical sense, then you're actually doing something to them, but that's a little bit different. That's not what we're talking about here. So, is that pretty clear? I hope that that's pretty clear. That's the difference between the subject and the object, between the nominative and the oblique case. It's just as simple as who's doing something and who's getting something done to them. It's really all that it is. I think that's pretty. I think it's pretty straightforward once you get used to it. It's just that if you've never thought about it before, if you've never really if you're not used to thinking about it in this way, then it might seem a little bit not very intuitive. And it takes practice. It does take practice. If you want to really be able to think about it properly in this way, then yeah, it definitely takes some practice. Now, that's pretty much it for English. That's pretty much all that you need to know for English. Since some people might have an interest in studying other languages which use a more developed case system, I'll go ahead and continue here to talk about a little bit about how cases work in some foreign languages with more complex case systems. If you just care about English, then you can pretty much stop here. This is all that you need to know about case in English. But for other languages, let's go ahead and back up a bit. I'll go ahead and I'll delete this, and I'll come back here. Now, in English, there's just basically the subject and the object. In many languages, however, there's a distinction between the direct recipient of an action and the indirect recipient. Now, how can we demonstrate this? What's an example of this? Let me go ahead and give you an example. Let's say, for example, just something, okay, a sentence like, I open the door. Now, this is me performing a direct action. The door is the direct object. What's the verb here? The verb here is open. The action here that's happening is I'm opening something. And what am I opening? I'm opening the door. And so the door is the direct recipient. The door is the direct recipient of the action. What's an example of an indirect recipient? If I use a sentence like, usually an indirect action will have a preposition, like, for example, I go to the door. Now, the door here is something that's, I'm not really doing anything to the door, am I? I'm not really, certainly linguistically, I'm not actually acting directly on the door, because usually you can tell the difference if it makes sense without anything in between. So like, for example, could you say, I go the door? No, a sentence like I go the door, that doesn't make sense. That's you can't do that. You can't say that. You can't directly go the door. That doesn't you can't linguistically say that. But you can say I go to the door. And if you're saying something like that, if you have to put a word in the middle like that, then what's happening here is the door is the indirect recipient of the action. Whoops. Door is, not door if. Door is the indirect recipient of the action. So, again, usually something is the direct recipient if there's no intervening verb. So, well, here there's the, because the door is the entity. You can't just say I open door. There has to be there has to be an article there in English. I guess if you want to make a sentence without I don't know. For example, if you say something like I see John, there you go. You can. There's no intervening verb, or not verb, but intervening word in here. It's directly I see John. So I'm performing an action directly on John. On the other hand, something like I go to John. You can see I can't say I go John, but you can say I go to John, and then he becomes not the direct recipient, but the indirect recipient of the action. This is a little bit less intuitive. Like I said, in English we don't have to worry about this, and so many native English speakers don't really grasp this very well the first time. It takes some time to get used to this, definitely. If you're learning a foreign language where this is important, then it's going to take some time to get used to this. But you have to understand there is a difference between a direct and an indirect recipient of an action. Now let me write a bit of a longer sentence here to kind of show how that relation plays out in a more not really a very complex sentence, but a sentence with a little bit more going on. Let's say I write a sentence like, I give the book to John. Now just look at the sentence for a moment. I give the book to John. Who or what is the direct recipient of the action here? Who or what here is the direct object of this sentence? Now, I personally, intuitively would say John. I'm doing something to John, right? I'm giving the book to John. So John is the direct recipient of the action, right? No, John is the indirect recipient, because what I'm actually acting directly on is the book. The book receives the action directly. I give the book. There's nothing in between the verb and the object. The book is the entity, and give is the verb, and so there's nothing in between here. The book is directly receiving the action, but John, technically I'm not really doing anything to John directly. I am giving the book to John, and so that makes John the indirect recipient of the action. It's a little bit tricky, isn't it? It might not seem intuitive at first, but here in this case, the book is the direct object, and John is the indirect object. Again, in English, these are both combined into the same case. Direct objects and indirect objects are both combined into the same case. But in many other languages, you have separate cases for this. Direct objects receive what's called the accusative case, and indirect objects receive what's called the dative case. And I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about, I'm sorry, I think that lower line is a little bit chopped off there, so there you go. Hopefully that's more visible there. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about German here in just a bit because, well, for two reasons. First of all, me personally, German is the only foreign language that I speak fluently enough to, I think, to properly be giving any kind of lessons on it. I'm certainly not at native fluency in German, but I speak at least enough German to be able to say a thing or two about it. So, so just for me personally, that's a good language for me to say something about because I've been studying it for a while. And also, secondly, German actually makes a relatively good introduction to cases, because you might have heard that German is a very difficult language. It probably is more difficult than English or French, but German makes a good introduction to cases because German has 4 cases, which is simpler than most other languages that have a well-developed case system. Because, like, for example, Latin I think has, what, 5 or 6 cases, if I remember right. Most Slavic languages, like Russian or Polish or Czech or languages like that, have 6 or 7 cases. So actually, if you're going to learn a language like that, it gets even more complicated. German has only 4 cases, and so German's a relatively good way to start getting used to cases if you have only spoken English all your life and are not really familiar with cases, or if you've spoken a Romance language like French or Spanish, which doesn't really have a very strongly defined case system and basically uses the same system of pronouns and word order that English uses. French and Spanish don't have a strongly sort of defined case system that some other languages have. So I'll go ahead here and talk a little bit about German. Now, German has it has the same nominative case as in English. So the nominative case in German, and most languages actually, is at least most European languages that use the case system, the nominative case is used for the subject. And then there's also the genitive case, which I talked about before, which is used for possession. So like, this car is ours. German has a similar case to indicate possession or ownership of something. But in German and in many other European languages, the oblique case for the object is split into the accusative and the dative case. And so that gives you 4 cases in German. Nominative case for subjects, genitive case for possession, and then the accusative and dative cases for the objects of sentences. And so if you're going to speak German, you have to get used to figuring out and kind of paying attention to whether something is the direct or the indirect recipient of an action. Because whether something is the direct or the indirect recipient of an action changes the case. It makes the case different. And so you'll have to kind of get used to thinking about it that way. It definitely is very strange. It's very, very strange if you've never thought about this before. Like I said, if you've only spoken a language that doesn't use this kind of case system, it will seem very strange at first. It takes a lot of getting used to. But let me go ahead and give you a couple of examples in German. I'll go ahead and speak German now just to show you how that works. Start with a very simple sentence like, well, I'll give you a sentence using just the nominative case in German. So, for example, you can say something like, ist groß. And hold on, I need to change my keyboard layout here to get the, there we go, to get that S scharf, to write it correctly. So, ist groß, this means he is tall. So if I'm talking about a man or a boy or whatever, and I say he's tall, I would say ist groß. That last letter there, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically like a letter S. It functions basically like a letter S, like an alternate form of a letter S in German. It's actually usually transliterated as 2 S's, but you can just, for simple purposes, you can just think of it as making an S sound. So ist groß. I can similarly say, if I want to be more verbose, der Mann ist groß. The man is tall. So is the German pronoun for he. This is used for subjects of sentences, the person who is doing something in the sentence. And der means the. This is, some of you might have heard that German has something like 200 words for the. Well, not 200, I'm exaggerating. It has about a half dozen words for the. And the reason why it has so many words for the is because the word changes depending on the case. So here now you're going to see a very clear distinction based on the case that this is about. So this is still just the nominative case here, because the man is doing something. In this case, his only action is existing, but still, is still a verb. Ist means is, and that is still a verb. Even if all he's doing is just existing and being tall, the man is tall. Is still a verb, and so it's still the man doing something. He's the subject of the sentence because he's the one doing something. He's being tall. That's his action. But now, let's say, for example, that I do something to the man. Like, let's just say, very simple, let's say I see him. Ich sehe den Mann. Now, what's different here? Well, ich is this is I, so this is like I am doing something, and sehe means to see, so I see something. And den also means the. But why are we using den instead of der? Because now this is the accusative case. And den is it's the accusative article for masculine nouns. German has what actually most European languages have. Almost every European language, at least major European languages, use nouns for all their, use genders for all their nouns. So not only men and women, but even inanimate things like tables and chairs and books and the ceiling and windows and doors, all those things have genders. This is true in almost every major European language except for English and Uralic languages. But in pretty much every major European, Indo-European language, there's a gender system like this where where nouns have genders. And so for masculine subjects, like in this case, the word for the is der. But in this second sentence that I've written, or I guess third or whatever, in this last sentence that I've written here, the word for the becomes den because this is the accusative case here. So now it's important to note this is only used for masculine accusative cases in German. This is only used for masculine accusative cases in German. Actually, it's not true. It's also used for something else. It's also used for it's also used for plural datives, which can also get confusing because it's actually used for more than one thing. But I don't even want to talk about that now. Just don't even worry about that. Just for this case, let's just say it's this is what you use for a masculine accusative thing. It would be different if it were a woman. If this were a woman, then we would actually say die Frau, but this is a man, and so it changes from der to den, because this is the, accusative case. Getting my keyboard layouts mixed up here. Now, what's an example of an indirect object? We talked before about if I give the book to John, for example, then John becomes the indirect recipient, right? So what happens if we say that in German? We can say, ich gebe das Buch, I give the book, zu dem Mann. Now, here the man has become dem. Why? Because he's the indirect recipient. This sentence that I've just typed out means, I give the book to the man. And so once again, the man is the indirect recipient here because I'm not giving the man. I'm not doing anything really to him. What I'm actually doing something to is the book, das Buch, but I'm giving it to the man. And so since the man is the indirect recipient here, the Buch is accusative case. Mann is dative case because he's the indirect recipient of the object. So here we see the three different types of the three main types of the for a man. If the man is the subject of the sentence, the nominative case, I'll go ahead and write here, nominative case, then it's der Mann. Der Mann does something. He's the subject of the sentence, and so he's represented in the nominative case. Der Mann does something. Accusative case, something is done directly to the man. He is the direct recipient of a noun in the sentence, and so he's now den Mann. And if the man is the indirect recipient in the dative case, then he becomes dem Mann. And in German, a very strong clue comes from this word zu, which is cognate to the English to. zu is always dative in German. Anybody or anything that gets their action through zu in German, that's always dative case. So that's kind of a hint there, if you will. And that's it. And then German, so here we have the three major cases in German: nominative, accusative, and dative. And like I said, there's also the genitive case in German for possession of things, which I'm not going to talk about now because it works pretty intuitively. It works only for possession, and so you can usually figure out when to use it. And also, it's not even used very much anymore. Actually, if you talk to German people, they often complain that the genitive is being phased out of German because people will usually phrase their German in a way that doesn't make use of it very much anymore, which some people lament. For some people, it makes things simpler, and people say, that's good, let's simplify the language and make it simpler. And other people dislike it and say, oh no, we're losing the integrity of the language because people aren't using the proper genitive form anymore. They're substituting the dative for it. But we won't talk about that now. That's kind of a ongoing discussion in German linguistics. And like I said, you may not care about German. Maybe the German language specifically doesn't interest you very much, and that's fine. Not everybody has to speak German, of course. But if you want to learn a Slavic language, you will need to understand this, because most of the Slavic languages, again, like Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, they usually have around 6 or 7 cases which work like this. It's even more complicated. They have cases like this and then a couple of others. The exception is Bulgarian and I think Macedonian, which have a simplified case system, although they also have, I think, 3 cases, if I remember right. I haven't studied those languages, but Bulgarian is probably the simplest Slavic language because it has less cases. But if you want to study Russian or anything like that, then you will need these cases and then a couple more as well. Most Uralic languages, like Finnish, for example, or Hungarian, have around a dozen or so cases. I think Finnish has I think around 15 cases, if I remember right. It gets a little bit crazy. And Hungarian, I think, has something similar. Those are not they're not classified as Indo-European languages, and so they have a very different kind of structure. They have a structure which is a little bit alien to people who are accustomed to Indo-European languages. But yeah, if you want to learn a Slavic language, you will use these 4 cases from German, the same 4 cases that exist in German. Also Latin uses these, and I think a couple of others as well, if I remember right. So for any of those languages, this is something that you will run into probably fairly early when learning the language. If not, if you want to learn a language like French or Spanish, then you don't need to worry about any of this. But it's still helpful, even if you're just a native English speaker, even if you are only going to speak English and are only ever going to talk about things in English and don't care about learning a foreign language, it's still useful to understand what we mean when we say the subject and what we mean when we say the object of a sentence, because again, this will help you to understand why sometimes you say who and sometimes you say whom, and then you'll understand, okay, yeah, who is the subject, the person who does something, and whom is the object, the person who gets something done to them. So I guess that's it. Did I miss anything? Was there anything else that I wanted to talk about? I guess not. I guess that's it. I guess that's all. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Cases, Grammatical Cases. I hope that this was interesting, and perhaps you learned something, maybe even something useful. And if not, well, thanks for watching anyway, and I wish you all well. I wish you all great success in your use of language. And yeah, I guess I'm done. Thanks for watching, everyone. I will talk to you folks later. Bye-bye.